There are two races of man and two realities. Logically there cannot be less than or more than two. That is, there are two races and realities and no way to disprove this or discredit the arguments. There are of course many people who will assert, often vehemently, there is only one race of man and one reality. Of course, were this so, then this race of humans and this one reality would have to encompass all humans and all realities. But it cannot. Now it can be argued that these races and realities that it does not encompass does not exist. There are others who of course argue for several realities and even an unlimited number of realities and potentially, an infinite number of different sort of people. Now, it is quite possible to reject this position and claim this plethora of persons and realities is totally imaginary. There is no way to prove this. Once one has accepted there is a reality that encompasses all life on the planet and a reality that encompasses all the ideas held by those people, one opens oneself up to an expansion of this idea. In short, the one reality hypothesis is a relativistic hypothesis. If our ideas and realities are all relative and there is no one objectively defined reality that excludes all others, an absolutist reality in other words, then everything is possible. Christians have been arguing for hundreds of years that man without God has no boundaries, but neither does his conceptions have fixed borders either. Without God we cannot even close the borders on our nations. So, we ought not be surprised if our conception of reality becomes nebulous once we abandon God. But if we say there is only one possible reality, we have to make it all-encompassing to some degree. It cannot really focus on exclusionary language. To say reality is material and the product of evolutionary activities, is to say everything that exists has existed from the very beginning. This makes the naturalist conception absolutist in that it excludes everything that did not always exist and is not of the same substance as that which also exists. What is different is only different in degree. Everything that exists is related in a substantial and fundamental way to what has always existed or will exist. Reality is all one substance. As said, we may want to argue how many sub-realities there are in this one, all-encompassing realities, but the bottom line is that they all exist as one substance. These all have the same conceptual format. Even if we think there are other universes, these universes are part of the same conceptual framework. But that being said, there is still a reality that is excluded the minute we say there is but one reality, proving the one reality hypothesis is inherently contradictory. In other words, we can expand the one reality hypothesis to infinity, meaning there can be an unlimited number of alternative realities in a reality that encompasses all possibilities. But, perhaps oddly, the one reality hypothesis that includes all possible realities includes every possibility but one. The one reality hypothesis cannot include the two reality hypothesis. The one reality hypothesis cannot include a scenario in which a reality incompatible with the one reality hypothesis exists. There cannot be a third reality as all possible realities are contained in the reality that encompasses all realities. However, there must be two realities because there must be a reality that cannot be contained, by definition, within the parameters of the one reality hypothesis. The other reality is absolutist because it rejects the relativism of reality and the precepts of the one reality hypothesis. The second reality affirms that the propositions of the one reality hypothesis are a lie and contradictory. In other words, the two-reality hypothesis says there is one real, absolute reality and another set of assertions that are lies. There is, according to this position, lies and the truth. This accords to common sense and logic. We know there can only be one truth, but there can be an innumerable number of lies. Man without God can and does lie. Man without God is a physical thing that can only be given life through some kind of physical event, or string of events. Without God, what are we? What can we become if we start out as a physical thing? Indeed, it causes us to question what physicality is. What is this substance called matter, that ultimately cannot be physically experienced? When electrons hit electrons it merely wave pattern interference, without any material existing to transmit the wave. It's like an ocean with waves but no water. The simplistic view that we are a brain in a body in a universe makes no sense empirically, because this universe is seen only within the brain. What we observe is simply brain activity. The brain we see is actually just an activity taking place in our brain. There is no external reality because all of external reality is in our brain. Which leads us to question where our brain is located, since everything we see is actually within it. So, we really do not even know what our brain is, since we cannot see it. We only extrapolate from the brains we seem to see, to assume our brain is identical to the ones we can observe. If we are physical, we have no idea what we are because we have no idea what physicality is. At best, we can imagine it as a force field, or waves that self-propagate. The one thing we can be pretty sure of, reality is not a substance. Without God we have a lot of results or phenomenon without any source. Without God, there is no origin. Naturalists are required to posit infinity, which may as well be God, or assume things arose without any precedent. It's a lot to give up just to avoid positing the existence of God. The one-reality hypothesis cannot even make sense of itself, since it must discount the possibility of one reality because the one reality does not contain absolutes, and the one reality hypothesis, by definition, generates a reality that is absolute. In other words, without even bothering to see the positive benefits of assuming God exists, the negative impacts of denying him are substantial, unavoidable, and unresolvable. If we assume an uncreated creator exists, since the creator can be no more subject to the laws of his creation than an author is subject to the events he writes about, things begin with the act of creation. A beginning is the most natural of assumptions once we assume a creator God exists. There are many other things we can assume, once we have made the initial assumption as to God's presence in our lives. For example, it is natural to assume there is an absolute truth. There is a right and wrong. We could also assume there are those who follow God and those who do not. Rebellion is not the strange thing atheists would like us to believe it is. We like to think that rebellion is directed against God, but that makes no sense. One's behavior is rebellious, but one cannot rebel against God directly any more than one can rebel against nature. It comes down to the same thing. So, man rebels against a proxy of God, what we now call his church, but prior to the church it is a rebellion against those who live the right way. This is not an administrative issue, it does down to the heart of what it means to be a Christian. One does not need to know Christ or quote Scripture to be a follower of Christ or a follower of what is right. The law is written in our hearts for all to follow. Romans 2 verses 12 to 16. For as many as have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which shew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the mean while accusing or else excusing one another winky face. In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. And we must not forget, Romans 1 verses 18 to 23. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shewed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Indeed, for all intents and purposes, God could be reality, for the more we work against God and the reality he created, the worse it gets for us. At the most basic level it is not complicated. We have a purpose, and that purpose has several manifestations of ways of being revealed. However, they all come down to creating value, we need to do works of faith which bear fruit. In operational terms, this comes down to building the church. But the church is us so following the golden rule and the other injunctions of Scripture, and this means building up the faithful. But without God, we have no direction. There is no church to build, without God, nor is there any incentive to build others up. The most rational thing to do for a man without God, is to play the Christian, and when everyone trusts you, to scam them for everything they have. A man without God has an ad hoc morality that can be manipulated, changed, and fine-tuned according to the needs of the moment. Man without God must live in a relativistic universe in which induction is the path to truth. But truth is never certain, because in a relativistic universe, there is always the possibility of error and countervailing information. Thus, the man without God is always at risk, because no one can truly be trusted. And without this trust, the church cannot be formed. Man without God is nothing, for he has no direction or purpose. Without God everything is permitted, and while your personal morality may reject some options, you cannot demonstrate to anyone that your morality is superior to another's. Ultimately, what the man without God is left with is the law of the jungle, a law that states might makes right and the end justifies the means. The strong make the laws and the weak comply. There is no other way for the man without God. Of course, you may end up with a fairly reasonable ruler, but the most influential might also prove to be psychopathic. There is nothing more bizarre in human society than democracy, especially in a country where people have abandoned the long term for short-term gratification. When the majority of people want happiness and want it now, the country, when democratic, is headed for ruin. Man without God will prioritize happiness at the expense of long-term benefit. The man without God will indebt his children and all those who come after him, to give him immediate benefits. There is no long term without God, there is only the here and now, and us making life as pleasant as possible with the fewest limitations on our behavior, as possible. Without God, the only limitations we have are the ones we impose on ourselves, and for our own pleasure these are not many.